At 30, he ruled half the known world. At 16, he was just a prince with expectations. At 30, armies followed his command.
Follow me, men! To victory!
At 16, he followed orders. At 30, kings feared his name.
My liege, the scouts reported heavy resistance in that sector. Our flanks will be...
At 16, he studied theirs. At 30, he conquered cities. At 16, he was learning how. At 30, he led men into war. At 16, he trained beside them. At 30, he moved without hesitation. At 16, he was taught discipline. At 30, he trusted his strategy. At 16, he learned from Aristotle. At 30, he controlled the battlefield. At 16, he observed it. At 30, he built an empire. At 16, he built himself. At 30, his presence meant victory. At 16, his presence meant nothing. At 30, he rode into chaos. At 16, he learned to control fear. At 30, he commanded loyalty. At 16, he earned it slowly. At 30, he didn't wait. At 16, he prepared. At 30, he broke enemy lines. At 16, he trained to endure pain. At 30, he acted fast. At 16, he learned patience. At 30, he trusted no weakness. At 16, he removed it. At 30, he saw opportunity in war. At 16, he saw struggle as training. At 30, he stood above kings. At 16, he stood behind Philip II of Macedon. At 30, he decided outcomes. At 16, outcomes were decided for him. At 30, he moved with purpose. At 16, he built that purpose. At 30, he feared nothing. At 16, he faced everything. At 30, he was unstoppable. At 16, he refused to stop. At 30, history remembers his victories. At 16, no one saw the work. At 30, he became inevitable. At 16, nothing was guaranteed. At 30, he stood as a conqueror, because at 16, he chose discipline over comfort.